My name is Mike Konczal. I'm a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and author of the blog Rortybomb, and this is another episode of Fireside Chats, the Roosevelt Institute's channel on blogging heads. I'm really happy to be joined by my friend, Corey Robin.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, you got cut off for a second there.
Oh, sorry about that. So why don't you introduce yourself, Corey?
Sure. This is Corey Robin. I teach political science at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and I also blog at corey.robin.com and also at Crooked Timber.
Excellent. And you are the author of two books I highly recommend, a book called Fear, The Political Origins of an Idea. I'm sorry, I forgot the subtitle of it. And The Reactionary Mind, the more recent one, A History of Conservative Ideas. And you've just written a really fascinating essay for The Nation about Nietzsche and something called the Marginalist Revolution. So before we get into this, how did you get interested in writing about conservatives and ideas and movements on the right?
Kind of by accident, actually. I was asked to write a profile by the magazine Lingua Franca, which no longer exists. But I was asked to write a profile of a couple of conservatives who were moving to the left after the Cold War. This was back in 2000, and one of the conservatives was John Gray, who was a kind of a libertarian guru back in the 70s, a very important thinker in Britain on the libertarian right. From there I ended up reading quite a bit beyond the usual canon, and just got interested in it. Like I said, it was purely by accident.
Well, interesting. So, why don't you start by talking both the Nation piece and then just a response you've written, some of the critics of the piece that just went up at Crooked Timber and your site, corey.robin.com, the other day, have gone up. And I think they together they're just a really fascinating discussion of a topic that doesn't get a lot of coverage. So, it's a long piece, both of them are. So why don't we start by talking a little bit about what did you set out to investigate and research and write when you started off this project?
Well, the piece in The Nation, which came out in May, was really begins with this, what I thought was interesting juxtaposition between, on the one hand, Nietzsche, and on the other hand, a group of economists, first in the 1870s, who were called the marginalists, the people who invented the theory of marginal utility. And later, and more important for my piece, the Austrian School of Economics, particularly Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, and to a lesser degree, Joseph Schumpeter. And what I was struck by in this juxtaposition was the similarities, first in their ideas about value. And we could talk a little bit more about what precisely we mean by value, but generally the idea that value in the world, whether it be value in morality or value in economic goods, is not an objective property of the world or of those goods, but something that we, individuals, men and women, subjectively ascribe to things in the world. And it struck me that there was a whole revolution going on, not just in economics, but also in philosophy and culture, that could be fruitfully brought together. And the reason why, in particular, Nietzsche and these figures that I'm talking about in the field of economics, is that they are both powered by a very strong animus, intellectual, theoretical, philosophical, against socialism. And it was the bringing together of these ideas that their hostility to socialism, on the one hand, and their theories about value, and then on top of that, the connection that they drew between these things, that I was trying to get at, and that I thought coming out of that juxtaposition we would get a better understanding, really, of who these Austrian thinkers, Hayek and von Mises were. Because they've proven to be so important in the development of the right in the United States, in Britain, and elsewhere.
Can you, before we go further, I mean, it's useful to also just phrase that this is not it is, but it's not just solely a historical, deep dive into a, turn of last century's Vienna. How would you describe the importance of the Austrian School and Hayek and Schumpeter to the intellectual history of the right in the past century?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it came up again. We did a little forum on this in Brooklyn a couple of weeks ago that The Nation sponsored, and Suresh Naidu, who you know, who's an economist at Columbia, he raised the question that you're raising. How important are these guys to the development of the right? Aren't there other thinkers who are more important? And I guess what I would say is that I think that their importance is twofold. Particularly on Hayek's end, I think the importance for him in the development of the free market right in the United States is, one, organizational. There was a book of essays that came out a few years ago, edited by Philip Murawski, called The Road from Mount Pelerin. And in one of the essays that Murawski does, he really recasts and revises the development of the Chicago School of Economics and shows how important Hayek actually was, just as an organizational player, both in terms of attracting money and bringing together the sort of leading lights that became the Chicago School of Economics, and that he was really much more important than people had previously realized. So I think as an organizational actor, he's important. But I think also, and this is, I think, the crux of it, we have to remember that these were people who were committed to a comprehensive philosophy of political, social, and ultimately cultural life. They had a very broad vision of how society ought to be organized, and understood, again, particularly in Hayek's case, that you needed a political theory, a social theory, in order to make that organization, that reorganization of society happen. And so I think as philosophers of social life and the relationship between the economy and culture, they're really important, not just in the United States, but in Britain. Margaret Thatcher, there was a great piece that just came out in the LRB about Thatcher, and she read the Constitution of Liberty. It was one of her key texts. And also in Chile and other places around the world. So I think both organizationally and also philosophically, they're very important.
There's a story about Thatcher throwing the Constitution of Liberty on a table and saying, "This is what we believe."
Right.
That seems very very dramatic. So why don't we? Well, I definitely want to return. I'm actually reading Murawski's new book, which is really intense. All about neoliberalism, and it really ties into some stuff you brought up in your essay. We'll circle back to that, but why don't we dig into the essay a bit? So tell us a little bit about what was going on with subjective theories of value at the time, and how the labor theory value, and what came out of these new intellectual movements to challenge that.
Sure. I mean, in the 19th century, in the first half of the 19th century, there was a broad consensus amongst political economists, which goes back to the 18th century, that the way that value is determined in economic goods is by a host of inputs, that the cost of production is what determines the value of a good on the market. And the primary cost of production, the one that, and here I'm stepping a little bit outside the framework of the theory itself and more to the cultural resonance of the theory. The primary cost of production, the primary input that seemed to matter from the point of view of these economists and the culture, was the cost of labor. That labor really is the thing that drives the value of a good on the market. And again, this is probably something that I tried to stress in my response. This was not just an economic theory. This became a kind of whole cipher for a political culture and a moral culture. And by the time that we get to the second half of the 19th century, that culture came to be embodied in various movements of various labor movements, whether it was trade union movements, socialist parties that were beginning to develop, or international communist leagues and international communist movements. The basic idea was that labor is the worker is the driving engine and the driving agent, the source of civilization itself. And again, not just economically that the labor is the source of value and therefore should, recoup more in terms of his or her wage, but was really the source of culture itself. And here's where I think Nietzsche becomes very important, was that he really tapped into what the cultural consequences of that idea were, beginning in some essays he wrote in and around his first book, which is The Birth of Tragedy, but then onward throughout the rest of his career. This sense that there was a real, for Nietzsche, a real cultural cost and consequence, that basically culture would be lowered and jeopardized and threatened, and particularly high culture, by this elevation of the worker to be the front and center of society. So you have then this broad consensus, and again, by the second half of the 19th century, that consensus comes to be perceived and associated and congealed with, broadly speaking, the labor left, the socialist left, even the Marxist left, even though Marx himself had much more complicated ideas about all of that. So you have a group of economists, three in particular, William Stanley Jevons in Britain, Karl Menger in Austria, and Leon Walras in Switzerland. And I focus in the piece on the first two figures, in part, well, for a variety of reasons, but in part because they themselves were actually quite hostile to trade unions and this burgeoning socialist consensus. And they formulate an alternative theory of value, which is that value does not reside or come from the cost of production. It doesn't come from the production side. It comes from the demand side. That value is determined essentially by however much I, as the consumer of something, or the buyer of something, however much I'm willing to give up in order to get that thing. And so they completely transform the way we understand value. Now, they're predominantly writing in an economic idiom, with an economic theory in mind. And what happens is that later on, a few decades later, in the Austrian School, you have the expansion of that theory of value to say that it's not merely an economic theory, but it's also a theory of morality and of culture as well. And there's a lot of other steps that happen in the article that I'll talk more about. But I think that's the trajectory, and that's really what distinguishes these Austrian economists from other marginal utility economists who think of these value questions in strictly narrow economic terms. These Austrian thinkers think of value in much broader terms, and that's why, in fact, they're quite similar, and I put them in dialogue with Nietzsche because he also thought of value in much broader terms as well.
You use the phrase shared affinity and kind of bring in this concept of intellectual history. Why don't you talk a little about what you mean by that?
Yeah, an elective affinity. It's an idea, originates, I believe, with Goethe, but Weber really develops it, and I try to explain it in this follow-up post, what I mean about this, because it's a concept that makes people a little bit nervous, because you can, I think the criticism is that you can end up drawing all sorts of links and connections between people under this rubric of, elective affinity. That's a little bit slippery, but basically the idea is that that there's something in two ways of thinking that either has a very deep structural similarity or that makes it possible for proponents of these two ways of thinking to be drawn together. So it's not that, we should be clear about this. It's not that if I think X, I'm then logically bound to proceed to Y and Z, right? It's not that kind of an argument. It's that there's something in these two different kinds of an argument that would explain why somebody could think one thing and then find themselves thinking another thing in a kind of comfortable way. Or why a movement, in this case the conservative movement, could think one set of ideas about, let's say, culture or economics, and come out thinking another set of ideas, that come from a different trajectory.
Interesting. So why don't So one thing that kind of falls out, and in your essay really brings it out in an interesting way in the reaction to it, but I want to talk about it a little bit here, is that one thing that you see that could fall out of the kind of marginalist revolution is the idea of the kind of consumer citizen soldier, or consumerism. It can quickly lead you in a place where, say, everyone having a bare minimum, or the consumer is really the engine of the economy, and you can end up in these kind of very social democratic welfare states where making sure everyone is always purchasing and consuming, and therefore it's required that they have income, which leads to a whole other set of perhaps labor union or Keynesian mass consumption states, or other kinds of ways of managing the macroeconomy and the political economy to ensure that what we would now kind of at Hayek call, the middle class is always thriving and prospering, that inequality is muted, that growth is broadly shared. Those things all can kind of fall out of this. And your argument is that the Austrians in particular kind of anticipate this and kind of set up their own way of bringing in a certain elitism and hierarchy in the economy through their theory. And I want you to kind of explain that to the audience.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that because I think it's really critical, because I think some of my critics took me to be arguing that there was something inherently anti-labor, anti-socialist about marginal utility or theories of economics or subjective theories of economics. And of course, that's not the case. And I say this quite explicitly in my piece, but I think some critics passed over this. But as you say, it could empower a whole host of social democratic arguments, and in fact, historically, it did. A lot of and again, I'm not. I don't want to get too much into the economic arguments because it's a little bit far afield from my expertise. But in terms of the broad political culture of the liberal left in the United States at mid-century, or social democratic positions in Europe, is that even though they embrace a kind of marginal economics and with a heavy emphasis on the consumption side of things, it still is a kind of moral culture, a moral economy, political culture of that emphasizes the worker consumer, really as the kind of driving agent of society, and that leads to a host of social democratic policies. And the Austrians, as you said, really got that and understood that they had to defeat that extrapolation. And here is where I think they really take a quite different road from a lot of marginal thinkers, which is that they have this not only do they have a subjective theory of economy and of morals, but they have a very elitist theory, which is that these values that we're talking about, that the masses are going to have, the things that the masses are going to want, are ultimately going to be shaped, according to these Austrian thinkers, and they have different ways of making the argument, by great men. Whether it be entrepreneurs, and here Schumpeter, I think, is really important, really emphasizing the central role of the entrepreneur, or of men of great wealth. And these can be either capitalists, Hayek says, or just men of great wealth who are sort of outside the capitalist market. And Hayek, makes this argument in many ways. The simplest and most familiar one is he says that men of great wealth, men of leisure, subsidize these kind of very boutique items of consumption, and they can pay great amounts of money for that. And that in the process of that, it enables the producers of those items to experiment with different ways of making these things more cheaply, more efficiently, and that ultimately, through that process, you turn what were originally luxury items of the rich into mass consumption items. And Hayek talks about stockings, for instance, as an example of this. That's the simplest argument. But Hayek takes it much, much further. And again, this is a point of contention between me and my critics, the libertarian critics, because I think they miss this part of Hayek. It's not simply that the wealthy ultimately subsidize the creation of mass consumption items. It's that they create mass tastes, mass desires, and ultimately mass beliefs, moral and cultural and political beliefs. And here again is where I think the Nietzsche connection is really important, because Nietzsche also has a theory of supermen creating new values. He was much more ambivalent about the idea of the masses embracing those new values, but he did believe that what marks an elite, what makes an elite, what makes a ruling class for Nietzsche, is this ability to create new forms of value that structure our horizons. And that is very similar to how Hayek talks about men of wealth, men of leisure, is that they really are creating these new forms of belief, these new forms of horizon in which the rest of us live.
Right. You had a great quote in your response piece, or first response piece, about the issue of inheritance taxes and why they're so important. And do you remember that off the top of your head?
I don't remember the quote off. I mean, I know what the quote says,
Right.
but I don't remember the exact words for it. But yeah, I mean, Hayek has in two places in the Constitution of Liberty a discussion about inheritance. And he says, a lot of people believe that parents and the family is a good vehicle for passing on moral beliefs, cultural beliefs. And he said, but what they don't want to take the next step, which is that it's also, if you believe the family is a good vehicle or instrument or institution for passing on moral and cultural beliefs, the reason why that's the case, or a necessary condition for that, is that you have to be able to pass on material wealth to your children as well. In other words, you can't separate the moral and the cultural on the one hand from the material and the economic. What makes a family, in terms of as an ongoing institution for the transmission of values and cultural inheritance, in part is the economic dimension as well. And then he takes it a second step, which is to say, this is how you create a real ruling class, or a real elite. I think he uses the phrase elite, is that, the first generation, let's say, of a family has, a certain level of cultural and economic development. And then the next generation has a higher level of cultural and economic development. And then the third generation is, let's say, even higher than that. And it's through that process of inheritance that each generation gets better morally and culturally, but intimately linked with that is that they also get better economically and financially. And that's how he says that's how you create a ruling class. And that a great ruling class is precisely because they are the beneficiaries of these previous generations' attempts, both successful and failed, to generate wealth on the one hand, but also to generate ever more sophisticated norms of cultural and moral life. And the upshot of this, he says, is this is why you should not, have inheritance taxes, because what you're going to really do is, destroy the basis for a genuine ruling class in society.
Right. It's interesting to see how much has changed. I mean, just to go back to the earlier point, when we talk about, mass consumption coming out of the Great Depression, I mean, that's not just something we're kind of, looking backwards and describing. I mean, you look at, I've been reading a lot about like the Second New Deal and the kind of stuff that's coming out of World War II, and you see books by the Paul Krugmans of the day, or the leading, the Peter Orszag's of the day, I suppose, the leading intellectuals of the Second New Deal, meant for public consumption. And it's very clear, like mass consumption. This is how we will build a new society. This is how we will, equalize wealth. The economy will grow so fast when it's, unhinged from these demand constraints, that everyone will get, the rich will have more, but they'll have a smaller piece of the pie and they'll still be happy. And it's just such a language that's missing, especially these days. What's particularly interesting.
Can I just say one thing about that? I mean, just to.
Absolutely.
The thing I would emphasize is that it's not just on the distribution side. It's not just that, that things will get redistributed and the rich will have less. What strikes me about those arguments is, again, it's the sense of who is the critical agent that makes it all happen. And in many, many ways, the critical agent is this, mass of workers, and that they're the ones who really drive the car as a whole. And I think that's what's, really different from Hayek and von Mises. I mean, they have a theory of the mass in one sense, Hayek does, but ultimately behind that mass are these great men. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted you.
No, absolutely, and you see that nowadays, right? So, like, I watch the current Great Recession very closely, and both the actual numbers of it and the way people talk about it. And we use the phrase kind of as a joke, but it has really serious and deadly implications. Is the concept of the job creator, right? You hear this all over and over again, and people, and even the more progressive caucus or President Obama, is kind of centrist Democrats are very conscious of the idea of the job creator is ultimately the one who's creating the real engine of growth. And you saw it with the real fawning coverage of Steve Jobs at Apple. And I remember when Steve Jobs died, maybe about 2 years ago. You had people, like Steve Jobs created, all this great stuff of value, refined all the stuff that, all the way we live with the internet and technology. You have people saying, wait a minute, that's actually thousands of people. And it was actually interesting because on one hand, you'd think that was the kind of Hayekian argument. It's like, oh, these thousands of workers at Apple and Apple's contractors and people at Foxconn are the ones who actually figured out how the glass would work in your iPhone or figured out how to make, your computer have icons that were easy to use. And altogether, they made this thing of value. But no one ever actually discussed it that way. They said, no, this great man who was an innovator, and used Schumpeter's phrase, this entrepreneur, like really was the one who created this value. And I'm curious how it actually kind of surprises me because I don't think of the Austrians as particularly foundational in the U.S. context, but they've had a real resurgence, it seems, since the Great Recession. There's the kind of the cartoony parts of Hayek in The Road to Serfdom, which has influenced a lot of Glenn Beck's writings, and it's on the bestseller list. And I hear the phrase creative destruction as if this recession isn't the kind of Keynesian failure where it's just supply and demand is not meeting, the government has a role to play, but instead this economy is even though it's very weak and there's a lot of unemployed people, it's doing some sort of creative churning that's ultimately going to make us all stronger in this creative destruction sense. I'm curious what you make of this resurgence over the past couple of years of kind of Austrians, and if not in their concrete thoughts, certainly them as a presence.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I am not really sure I have a good answer to it. Why at this particular moment? I mean, it's interesting because after Glenn Beck, he really catapulted The Road to Serfdom. It went back on the bestseller list because of him. And then after that, the University of Chicago Press reissued the Constitution of Liberty and said, this is a text for our time. The simple-minded answer is that is kind of you already have given it, I think, which is that the way people understand the economy today, the only way they can understand the economy today, is that it is the work of these great men, these job creators, these Steve Jobs, people like that. And, in some ways it's sort of, it's like waiting for Godot. We're waiting for that great man or these great men to kind of make it happen. And they're not. So aside from that, though, I don't really know, but it is interesting. But, I just want to say, the Road to Serfdom, in some ways it's, it gets a bad rap. I had to kind of reread it for this. And I guess originally I always thought, I taught it in graduate school and I thought, there's not much there. But in rereading it, there's a couple of chapters that I really think are actually worthwhile, where Hayek really lays down some very clear markers and very interesting markers about the relationship between the market and morality. And it's a kind of fascinating argument he makes that, in a nutshell, the argument is that, and the Nietzschean overtones are really fascinating, that if you take seriously the idea that what a moral act is or requires is some kind of sacrifice of something of yourself, right? That in order to honor some kind of moral belief, you have to give something up. Hayek's argument is, let me just say one other thing about that oftentimes that the notion of what the ultimate thing to give up for the sake of a moral principle is your life. That's why you have a whole, coming out of the First World War, a whole notion of battlefield ethics, that it's really on the battlefield that your real beliefs are ultimately tested. How much are you willing to die for something? But what Hayek does is to say that it's in the economy, in the marketplace, that you get the truest measure of your beliefs, how much you're willing to give up, which is something he says we do all the time in the economic realm. And he makes that argument as the road to serfdom. And he goes further than that, and he says, and this is the problem with politics. In the electoral realm, he says, politicians promise you everything. They say you don't have to give up anything, right? You don't have to sacrifice anything at all in order to get all these things that we're going to give you. But in the market, you do have to sacrifice something. And that's why the market is ultimately really the best test or sphere or institution to divine what one's moral beliefs are. And so there's a really interesting argument there that he develops, I think, most thoroughly in The Road to Serfdom, and it gets overlooked because it has some more obvious anti-socialist arguments that people fixate more on.
I'm interested. I'm actually going to jump this question in the queue. I know you've taught Hayek, and I think I think for most people they either come across Hayek either from The Road to Serfdom, which can. We'll talk about that in a second, but they either come across it from The Road to Serfdom, or I have an economics background and an MBA background, so or they come across an essay called "The Use of Knowledge in Society," which has to do with the idea of the economy as this information processor, and that's smarter than any one individual, or sees more than any one individual sees. I'm curious how you would encourage people to read Hayek, particularly people on the left who want to kind of understand the changes that's happened. Particularly because I know Constitution of Liberty, which I've not read, has a whole theory of judges and legislation that is kind of foreign to me, and I've heard it referenced by libertarians, and it seems really weird, but it seems sort of also very influential for people.
I mean, what I would recommend is, first of all, the essay that you said, The Use of Knowledge, I think is actually really helpful, and just for people, particularly on the left, because they don't know about this knowledge argument in Hayek, I think it's actually kind of, it's influential, and it's actually quite interesting. So I think, and makes connections, I think, between a certain kind of economic way of thinking and certain more romantic ways of thinking about knowledge and reason that go back, a long time in the sort of the counter-enlightenment. So I think it's a good essay. There's a couple of chapters in The Road to Serfdom. I don't remember their particular numbers or names, but that I would also recommend, particularly like where I'm saying he gets into some of these arguments about morals and markets and their relationship to each other. And then I would recommend both the Constitution of Liberty, and if people are feeling particularly ambitious, the Law, Legislation, and Liberty. And I think in both of those two works, he really develops this theory of adjudication and of judges, which I didn't talk about at all in my piece, but I think even strengthens the case, that I want to make even more about the elitism, because, people, I think on the left we have this sort of stereotype and false view that what neoliberalism is all about is, the deregulation or the stripping down of the state, the minimization of the state in favor of the marketplace. And that's just, if you read Hayek, that's just not at all what's going on there. What he's trying to do is to really recast how we understand the state and what parts of the state we ought to focus on. What he really wants to minimize is the power of the legislature. He has a huge problem with legislatures. And also, he wants to enhance the power of the judiciary. And it's a judiciary whose role is to really interpret he oftentimes talks about the common law, and to uphold the spirit of the common law. So not just the particularities of any one piece of legislation, but really to understand the centrality of common law and to model legislation on common law, but then to uphold the overall spirit of the common law. And the reason why I think it's kind of interesting, and I haven't written about this, but I'd like to do so at some point. You and I are both fans of Karen Oren's book, Belated Feudalism. And there, as you know, she makes this case that, that the feudal dimension in the United States had two components. People say the United States has no feudal dimension, and she says it does. One is the structure of labor and employment law, or employment law, we should say, the law of master-servant, which was borrowed from common law in medieval Britain. It came to the United States. It survives the Constitution, and it persists, she says, until into the early part of the 20th century. So that's one part of it, and it's a law that's extremely hierarchical and based in master-servant models from medieval feudal Britain. But the other piece of that she says is this notion of the judge as the enforcer and the upholder of this common law over and against the legislature, and not in a kind of con law, Ronald Dworkin sort of sense of the word at all, but much more as the upholder of this ancient order of the law from Britain over and against legislative interference. And it's fascinating when you read her argument to then go back and read Hayek's argument, because he's making a very, very similar case.
Interesting. Yeah, there's the Oliver Wendell Holmes quote about how the Constitution does not enact Herbert Spencer's social statistics. Like, the judges aren't there to enforce this kind of laissez-faire, model. They're there to work with, be a check on, but ultimately work with legislative processes. And that whole right of free contract, which I'm always very interested in, that arises in the 1890s as a reaction, at least as I understand the literature now, it arises directly as a reaction to a lot of socialist movements in the late 19th century, has this really complicated relation with judges. And I notice a lot of these, like the leading hard libertarians, I think I've written about this, kind of seem to be implying that, they're all about economic freedom, but they're really about is moving, essentially economic freedom or economic rules and regulations outside of the legislation to judges or to a kind of higher, more abstract first, liberty kind of principle. You mentioned Philip Moravsky, and I'm actually going to hold up his book, Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. To conclude, I kind of want to talk about how neoliberalism, and we'll dissect the word a little bit, plays into your broader theory about the right, because I think that's underlying this essay and the response in a very interesting and provocative way. One thing that Moravsky really points out about when we think of the Mount Perlin Society and Hayek and Milton Friedman, this kind of new wave of classical liberalism, is that it's actually very contrasted with traditional classical liberalism. He's very keen from his book on Mount Perlin to talk about monopoly and a couple of very specific things about corporations. But from their point of view, and Moravsky gets it from Foucault, is that it's a project where the state very much creates markets. If you go back to Adam Smith and the point where kind of modern governments are very much being created, and so are markets, they have this real romanticized notion that the market is something that just exists, or something that will exist better if the government just got out of the way, or the government can basically either get in the way of it one way or the other. Where for neoliberals like Hayek, it's very conscious procedure that they have to engage and take over the state and use the state to create the markets that will then reflect certain values and distributions and priorities that they thus create. So I'm kind of curious, how do you understand neoliberalism as a relatively new thing that distinguishes itself from, we've already talked about the mixed economy kind of social democracy versus the more classical liberalism, and and ultimately how does it interact with the more conservative movement as we understand it, especially in the United States?
I think Moravsky is really helpful on this. There's the Verso is sending me the book. I haven't gotten it yet, but from the road from Mount Pelerin, he makes a similar argument there, and I think it's really useful. Is that what these guys? Not only was the state integral to their understanding of markets and the economy, but it was really integral to their political project, which was to get control over the state and to use the state for these purposes. And so I think, what I would say then, picking up the last part of your question, is I think this points to three things that are really, really important that connect with how I understand the right. The first is, as opposed to the classical liberals, Adam Smith's opponent, antagonist, whatever you want to call it, was not the labor movement. It was not a socialist movement. These guys, that is their antagonism. That is their, in the Schmittian sense, that is the enemy around which they frame all their ideas. And, this is not, you just, read the introduction to the Constitutional Liberty, read the introduction to von Mises's most famous work, Socialism, which is on socialism. They have a sense of socialism and labor, the labor movement and communism more generally. That communism is downplayed for Hayek because he's writing a little bit later when the Soviet threat is somewhat receded. But that is the polemical foe that has to be destroyed, and it's very important. That's not just kind of background music. That is foreground. Number one. Number two, and this is the argument that I made in the Reactionary Mind, that any reactionary movement, conservatism, is not only will it, seek to, not only does it arise and seek to destroy this kind of insurgent, democratic, revolutionary, whatever word you want to use it, challenge, but it will, in the course of meeting that challenge, oftentimes be influenced by and borrow from that challenge. And I think you see this very clearly in the Austrians, which is in their notion of using the state to organize the economy, and which really makes them very different from the classical liberals. In other words, the kind of arguments that they make about the state and the centrality of the state to their imagination, one of the reasons why you don't see that kind of thing in Adam Smith is precisely because of whom the neoliberals are targeting, and in whose context they grew up, which is the labor left and the socialist left, and the centrality of the state toward the organization of the economy. So that would be the second thing I would say. And then the last, and this is the where I really tried to kind of hint at, is that, and this is really an argument much more against people on the left than it is against people on the right. I think we on the left tend to think of neoliberalism as in too much as the triumph of bourgeois individualism, of market values and things of that sort. And I think what that misses is, and this is why I think Nietzsche is so important, is Nietzsche had this concept of grosse politique, which is, great politics. Not the kind of petty bourgeois politics, that seeks to, create and grow an economy, but the politics of moral and cultural transformation. And what I think what the Austrians did was to take that idea, I mean this in a metaphoric sense, that they're not really borrowing from Nietzsche here, but to reimagine the economy and the marketplace as the realm of great politics. In Schumpeter, this is very explicit, that the entrepreneur is really a kind of aristocratic overlord. And he says at one point, specifically, I think in Theory of Economic Development, his early work, that entrepreneurialism is really the one opportunity we have in the contemporary world for the kind of medieval aristocratic lordship somebody might have experienced, 500 years ago. And in Hayek's case, it's these aristocratic tastemakers in the economy. But that what neoliberalism is ultimately about is a kind of reinvention of aristocratic great politics in the realm of the economy. And I think you could see this in all sorts of ways, whether it's the, and this is a kind of controversial issue that came up in this debate, but whether it's in the embrace of Pinochet and the kind of the use of this kind of great man dictator to create a kind of market economy, or in just sort of economic actors like Steve Jobs and people like that. You see it in all sorts of ways, that we really want to liberate these types, these great men, who are going to kind of recreate the world stage in their image.
In the essay, towards the end of the Nation essay, which is called Nietzsche's Marginal Children, and we're going to have a link right below this, you quote Perry Anderson talking about the four figures. I don't know when he wrote this essay, but talking about the four figures of 20th century conservative canon. I'm going to read a bit from the essay. Schmidt, Hayek, Michael Oakenschaft, and Leo Strauss. And you talk about how Anderson is so taken with the bravado and brutality of Strauss and Schmidt. Carl Schmitt was a philosopher for the Nazis. Talked a lot about the government. The government is always kind of perpetually at war with its enemies, and how liberalism had this essential weakness about having to compromise. And you'd be able to describe this much better. And Leo Strauss, of course, the University of Chicago professor, who was known for having this kind of cult. What was often described like as a cult-like followers of graduate students who became the neoconservatives and were very influential in the Iraq War. And your quote here is great, or you're right here. Your write-up is great. He's so taken with the bravado and brutality of that self-styled realism that he can't grasp the far greater daring and profundity of Hayek's political theory of shopkeeping, his effort to locate great politics in the economic relations of capitalism. And I'm kind of curious how you see the way Hayek, and you see it in Paul Ryan, for instance, who's kind of the avatar of conservative politics right now in the United States, who's very fascinated with Ayn Rand, which is definitely true, but he's also very fascinated with Hayek by all accounts. And I'm kind of curious how you see that, how these other kind of philosophers of the right and their visions of hierarchy and conservative politics have kind of fallen by the wayside while neoliberalism is still chugging
Yeah,
along.
it's really interesting. And just if I could be a little bit autobiographical, when I first began writing about the right after that lingua franca piece, the next thing that I wrote was about the Iraq War and about the neocons. And my argument there was that, people on the left really overestimate or overstate the economic or the oil dimension of the Iraq War. What I saw in the neoconservative arguments, many of which have their sort of origins in Strauss, Leo Strauss, and a kind of Nietzschean great man theory, was the idea that war was the sphere of martial values and great values, aristocratic values, and that boy, is that rain out there you've got?
There's a garbage truck that's doing its thing, so I'm gonna probably try to find a way to cut my volume. But please keep going.
So anyway, in my argument in a series of pieces I did in around 2003, 2004 was that the neocons were so disgusted with the kind of commercial triumphalism and the market triumphalism of the post-Cold War era that they saw in Iraq an opportunity to kind of deliver themselves from the cultural ennui and the decadence and the miasma of Clinton-era market triumphalism. So in other words, that there was a dimension of that war that was, oddly enough, not anti-capitalist, but anti the market culture. And that was really originally my argument. And so I saw a very sharp distinction between neoconservatism, warrior values, on the one hand, and neoliberal market values. But it was in the course of reading and teaching Hayek that I came to this, I think, very different position that you now see in my thinking, which is that no, the market for these guys, for people like Hayek, was really about the reinvention of great Nietzschean heroic values, and then so this then gets to your question, which is, back in the early aughts, when George W. Bush and the Iraq War was on everybody's radar, there was a lot of focus, and I certainly was myself part of this, on the neocons, and you saw a whole revival of the theories of Leo Strauss, who's become quite important in the canon, and also Carl Schmitt. And it's interesting, if there's been a whole revival of interest in the right, And if you go to, a graduate program or look at, what's on the reading list, you will see Michael Oakeshott, Leo Strauss, Carl Schmitt. And, there's some debate amongst, people about whether Schmitt belongs on the left or the right. I think it's pretty obvious he was a right-wing thinker. But anyway, those are the thinkers. And Hayek is never there. And in fact, at the Graduate Center where I teach, he was never on the reading lists at all. And what strikes me as interesting about that is that the political projects that we associate with Carl Schmitt, namely fascism, Nazism, and Leo Strauss, namely neoconservatism, have had fairly short shelf lives, right? Very particular to a couple of geographic areas and very limited. Whereas the political project associated with Hayek, neoliberalism, has had a very long shelf life. It's global, and at least, seems to be going quite strong. At least, politically, it's being challenged, but we haven't seen any kind of real overthrow of it by any stretch. And so I think there's this weird thing, and again, this is much more about the left and about certain academic cultures, and I think that Perry Anderson essay is really an exemplar of this, where Strauss and Schmitt, and to a lesser degree Michael Oakeshott, are held up as these very deep and profound thinkers, and people, there's been endless dissertations written about them, and yet we kind of dismiss Hayek, who I think of the four, not only was he the most politically, in the long term influential, or his ideas, but in some ways I think there's a kind of far greater radicalism and profundity at work in his ideas, which is namely, like I said, the importation of these sort of Nietzschean notions. And again, I'm speaking metaphorically here. I'm not saying he read Nietzsche and did this, but these Nietzschean notions of elitism and great, that were so important in the late 19th century, and to situate those ideas in the economic realm itself. A long time ago, Albert Hirschman had a terrific little book called the economist who recently died, economist and intellectual historian, called The Passions and the Interests. And his argument was that one of the most important arguments for capitalism in the 18th century was that it would tame warrior values, that the commercial activity and commercial life would be a way of pacifying more dangerous passions and emotions, warrior emotions, and that they would pacify them into the world of doux commerce, gentle commerce. And what's interesting, and if we think about that argument, you then see how even more important the Austrian economists are, not as economists, but as political thinkers, because what they really do, let's assume for the sake of the argument that Hirschman is right, that that capitalism was sold in the 18th century as a way of pacifying warrior values. Well, then what you could say that the 20th century was about was the reinvention of those warrior values and relocation of them precisely in the market, in the economy, where these 18th century thinkers had hoped to banish them from. And I think that's adds another twist to Murawski's argument about the distinction between classical liberalism and the neoliberalism of the Austrian economists.
Well, excellent. And on that note, Corey, thank you so much for joining me today, and I highly encourage people to check out your books and these essays.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Take care.